Because players-only meetings are not effective when the person that's calling the meeting, the captain who says, hey, we need to sit down and talk, isn't owning it. They are already distancing themselves and separating themselves from the experience, isn't even owning the situation, and is already separating themselves from what just happened, and they're already beginning to point fingers. Then what do you think happens? Trust is lost throughout the entire team. And so everybody else who's sitting around the room, that all of a sudden it isn't an open dialogue, trust has been lost, and everybody now is looking around to say, well, if this is about finger pointing, then everybody begins to protect themselves and or begin to point the finger at somebody else. What are the elements of players-only meetings that do work, that are effective? That's what we're talking about today.
Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced. The best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic, to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world.
Hey everybody, it's Jason, and welcome back to the Thermostat Podcast. Wherever you are and however you're coming to the podcast today, welcome back. So glad that you are here. As always, it is my hope with this podcast that this is a place for you to step back, to take a deep breath, to think, to have your mind and your heart engaged, and to just have some space in your day and your week and your month to step back and to take that deep breath. So glad that you are here. I am more convinced of this than ever, that authentic leadership and teams and organizations, groups of people of any kind that are creating compelling cultures in the world today are as needed as ever. So again, welcome back, and glad that this is a place for you to step back and to think. If this is your first time in the podcast, welcome. If you're somebody who's been a loyal listener from day one, a part of all the seasons of this podcast, then I'm so glad you're still with us. If you're new to the podcast, I just invite you to go back and listen to some of the first seasons of the podcast. So many great thought leaders have joined this conversation, and then there are other good inspirational nuggets and other thoughts that I think will be valuable along your journey. So thank you again for being a part of today and being a part of these conversations. I hope this is a valuable part of your week and your months in your own journey. So as always, thank you to everybody out there who takes a moment to share this, to share these podcasts with people in your network, on your team, throughout your organization that should be a part of these kind of conversations. Thanks for everybody that subscribes, of course, who takes the time to rate 5 stars, of course, leave a nice review. All of those ways in which help amplify these messages further into the world. That's the way the algorithms work. And so thank you for everybody. I hate asking for this, but thank you for everybody that rates and reviews and does all those things and helps to share this so that these messages can reach further into the world. I truly appreciate it. So thank you. Today we're going to talk about the concept of a players-only meeting. A players-only meeting. So even if you're not a sports person, anybody associated with sports, you're going to be familiar with that term. But even if you're not a sports person, hang with this conversation, because obviously this is about meetings of people on any type of team or group environment of any kind when there's conflict or disappointment, or you've reached a critical, serious moment when the team needs to come together and have an important conversation. That's what we're talking about today. But if you're a sports fan, then you're familiar with the folklore around quote-unquote players-only meetings. And you maybe have been on a team in your own experience in your life, a team at some point in your life where there was conflict or disappointment or had reached a serious moment in the season, and maybe the captain of the team called for a quote-unquote players-only meeting. And again, the spirit behind this was, with the coach not present or the coaching staff not present, where the players get together and are going to then have a serious pivotal conversation to try to get the team back on track. So you've either experienced this maybe in your own life at some level of sports, or at least you're familiar with the kind of folklore that is this players only meeting across sports, because, we all know of sports writers or other coaches or players that have suggested at different times that, players-only meetings were needed, or maybe, hey, it may be time for a players-only meeting when a team is starting to get off track. But the topic for today, again, beyond sports, is, are these quote-unquote players-only meetings effective? And every team and organization on the planet, no matter what the mission of your team or organization is, every single group of human beings on the planet comes to a point in their lives where they need to have that kind of players-only meeting. But what are the elements that make those players-only meetings effective? And what are the elements that maybe get them off track and or not very effective? So today, we're going to break that down. I'll start off by telling a story. I still remember as a college freshman, and some of you that on this podcast know that I played college basketball. I played basketball at Denison University, a small college in Ohio. And I loved basketball. Many of you know that. I love being a part of a team. It's been a valuable part of my experience, of my working together with a group of people for a common goal, and the chemistry involved, how to create a culture of a group of people to bring out their own individual strengths for the betterment of the team. All of those things that I've been lucky to learn, and great people that I've been lucky to be around to help shape the way that I think about forming teams and competing and having a shared vision and shared goal, many of which, I've been lucky again to have as experiences throughout my life in athletics. But I still remember this moment as a college freshman and in the midst of a very intense practice where coaches were yelling and screaming, and the team wasn't playing very well, and I'm a freshman, and so I'm still learning and getting used to the culture in this program. And all of a sudden, in the midst of a intense practice, our coach, in the middle of a rant, just says, "Get out of here." And he kicks the entire team out of practice. And he says some words that I can't repeat on the podcast, but he points to the locker room, and says, "Get out of here," and just kicks us all out of practice in the midst of it. Well, at that moment, again, everybody went running out of the gym, and we went down the hallway and up the stairs and back to the basketball locker room. And we came in there, and one of the captains had called for a quote-unquote players-only meeting. And so I still remember the scene as we sat there around our locker room, everybody sitting at their lockers, but in a big kind of circle, around the locker room, everybody sweating and still kind of wrapping their heads around this intense moment where we had just been kicked out of practice, and everybody in their own minds trying to figure out what was happening and why was coach so angry and all of those things. And yet, the captain had called for this players-only meeting. And so there we sat in the locker room in the midst of this kind of intense, silence for a second. But it was also kind of a funny scene, actually. It actually, going back to the 90s, I'll date myself a little bit, but this is the, kind of early to mid 90s. And here we are sitting around, and the captain was, he's a senior and I was only a freshman. And so he was a few years older than me. And there he sat in a jock strap. He had taken off his jersey and he'd kind of begun to change, but he was sitting there just in a jock strap. It was a hilarious scene, almost out of a Saturday Night Live skit or a made-for-TV movie or something. So we sat there, and again, we're all dripping with sweat, sitting there, and the captain who called the meeting was sitting there just in his jockstrap, which by that point, I never wore a jockstrap. That was a different generation. So just because I was a few years removed, I was sitting there, and I'm still in my practice gear. And immediately, this players-only meeting began. And as I'm looking around the room, and again, this kind of funny scene that I was still getting used to, all of a sudden, I'll never forget the very first phrase that came out of this senior captain's mouth. It started with, "You guys better. You guys better." And then that's the part of it that I remember. The rest of it began to trail off, and it actually gets quite fuzzy at this point of what his point even was. But he started out this players-only meeting with, "You guys better." And all of a sudden, even as a freshman, I remember my ears just tuning in to that he used the term "you." As he was looking at the team, he said "you" as if he was distancing himself from what had just happened. And he didn't use the words "we." He didn't, "we need to get better" or "we need to think." He didn't use the word "us" or "hey." He didn't take the approach of saying, "hey, I want to listen for a second. What do you all think?" Or, "hey, how are you feeling right now?" He didn't take that posture at all. The first posture, as he was upset, he started out with "you guys," as if this was on everyone else and the blame was you outside rather than we, and then rather than us. And certainly didn't take a posture of listening, of asking for any feedback or how anybody else was feeling or thinking about the situation of getting kicked out of practice or what did anybody think we ought to do next. It was "you guys," and then he lost me. It was a hilarious moment and something that again felt like almost out of a skit, but a hilarious kind of lack of leadership and a stumbling over the next few minutes as people, a lot of finger pointing was to follow. And at this point in the evolution of the program, again, I was just beginning into it, but, there hadn't been a great history of winning, and there hadn't been a great history of, I think, leadership. And so at the time, this was kind of the culture of the way they did things, that it was, finger pointing and the upperclassmen saying that, this is the way, but almost kind of blaming the rest of everybody else. And so there wasn't a culture yet of leading and or winning. And so, I'm quick to be able to say that, again, that was an important part of our process because we had to learn that and experience that and realize that wasn't effective and that wasn't going to help us. And over the next few years, as we built that into a winning few years, and changed the culture and the way that we approached what we did, that we changed it from that "you" to that "we" and that "us." But we had to go through that experience of that kind of ineffective communication and ineffective style to even realize that. So let me just say this, as we're talking about this idea of these players-only meetings, and again, I'm talking about it not just through the context of sports, because there are times in every single one of our relationships, the significant relationships in your life, and certainly on the teams in your work environments or throughout your entire organization, or the board you may serve on, the organization that you volunteer for, whatever those are, there are moments, of course, in time where a need arises to have a courageous conversation and bring the players together to say, where are we going and how are we feeling and what is it that we need to do next? And so let me just talk about the effective and ineffective ways of these players-only meetings. Because players-only meetings are not effective, clearly not effective, when the person that's calling the meeting, the captain who says, "hey, we need to sit down and talk," the person calling the meeting isn't owning it. They are already distancing themselves and separating themselves from the experience. That was the experience of the story I just described. But when the person calling the meeting isn't even owning the situation and is already separating themselves from what just happened, and they're already beginning to point fingers, then what do you think happens? Trust is lost throughout the entire team. And so everybody else who's sitting around the room, that all of a sudden it isn't an open dialogue, trust has been lost, and everybody now is looking around to say, well, if this is about finger pointing, then everybody begins to protect themselves and or begin to point the finger at somebody else. So we know this, that on every team and organization on the planet, there are moments where we need to gather the troops. We got to bring everybody together. We've got to have a courageous conversation. As you heard me say in the past, conversations that are the currency for change. I have no doubt that there will be time in the near future, I'm not sure when, but where there will be power in congregating again. Power in bringing your whole team together, your entire company and organization together in one space for that powerful keynote speech, that discussion that has to happen as a team, an entire organization about leadership and culture and mindset. But until then, we are in a virtual world. And so if I can add value to your team, your company, or organization through a virtual keynote speech, or just helping your team and organization have the conversation that's the currency for change that you need to be having internally, I hope you'll track us down and let us know how we can be helpful at jasonvbarger.com. For change, every relationship, every team on the planet has moments where they need to come together and have important conversations. But we can't have them when the people calling the meeting aren't owning it, are separating themselves from each other, or pointing fingers. So, what are the elements of players-only meetings that do work, that are effective? Because absolutely they're needed, and at different times along the way, they are going the effectiveness of those meetings are going to help either derail the team further or help the team get back moving in the right direction and get everybody pulling in the same directions. So when players-only meetings do work is when the internal leaders who are calling the meetings, whether that's the captains, again, outside of sports, whether that's the team lead, the department head, the key influencers on a team, whoever that may be in the environment that you're thinking about, when players-only meetings work is when those internal leaders recognize that the thermostat needs to be recalibrated. And so they bring everybody together, but they bring everybody together in a way that brings out these more effective elements of the team meeting. Typically, the most effective players-only meetings, they involve a sense of urgency. In every single, if you study change theory, again, if you go back to previous podcasts I've done about leading change and the 6 A's of leading change, if you've studied change theory, then you understand that the way that anything changes typically starts with some sense of urgency. So the best players-only meetings, one of the elements that's important is there's got to be a sense of urgency. That, hey, something has happened or something is happening, or we're in the midst of a pivotal moment where there's a little bit of a sense of urgency that we need and or want to change. And so there's a call for change, and there's an obvious need to address something. So there's a sense of urgency. That's one of the important elements. Another important element is that we have to create space for everybody in the team to participate. Again, everybody to participate. So not just a space for one person to then point the fingers and talk at people, but to create space for everybody on the team to participate, for everybody to be invited to have a voice, to share how they think, how they feel, and an environment to be able to allow the team to have each member of the team to have their mind and their heart engaged in this situation. So we've got to create space for everybody to participate. Then we need to make sure that as we enter into this courageous conversation that's the currency for change, we need to identify. And the most effective players-only meetings are the ones that also then identify and don't tiptoe around the obstacles that we're facing. to be able to identify what is the heartache that we're experiencing, what is the disappointment, where is it that we fell short or did not live up to our own expectations. And so we can't tiptoe around these obstacles, these heartaches, or these challenges that we are currently facing. So we've got to be able to identify and name those challenges. And then, once we're able to identify those challenges and those obstacles that we're experiencing, then most effective element of a players-only meeting is that we have to re-clarify and recalibrate that thermostat. The thermostat, which becomes that compass for how we travel together as a team. We have to re-clarify or recalibrate the thermostat. And one of the ways we do that is we re-clarify back to the mission. And to make sure that we're all on the same page around that locker room or that board meeting or that team gathering space or that relationship, we have to re-clarify and recalibrate the thermostat to remember back to the why. What's the mission? Why are we gathered together? And why are we even going on this journey together? What's the mission that's in front of us? And then we've got to re-clarify and recalibrate the thermostat once we have discussion of returning back to that mission, is then we need to be able to look out what I refer to looking out the windshield to then re-clarify, well, what is the vision? What is it that we hope to be different? Where is it that we're trying to go? If this is what we're currently experiencing and the obstacles and the challenges that we are currently being faced with right now, what's the vision out that windshield that doesn't exist yet? That place we're trying to go. What is the future that we're trying to create together? And then we need to re-clarify and recalibrate the thermostat around the how, which are the values. How are we committed to traveling together? How are we committed to working together as a team? What are the values of our team? Because somewhere along the line, in the midst of those obstacles or challenges we're facing, maybe we began to forget or get blurry or lose sight of the mission of why we're doing it, the vision for where we're trying to go, and also maybe we had begun to get off track around the values of how we're committed to traveling together as a team. As we begin to re-clarify and recalibrate that thermostat around the why, the where, and the how, then we're able to facilitate our way through those conversations that are the currency for change. Which, once we've set that reclarification and recalibrate the thermostat that way, then we're able to get to the last element of that important players-only meeting, which is, what's our strategy? We can't get to the strategy until we're re-clear and recalibrated around why are we doing it, where are we trying to go, and how we're committed to going. And then we can make sure that our strategy, which is what is within our control, what is our next move to make, what's the game plan for how we're going to move next. And to make sure that we, all around that locker room or that board meeting or everybody involved in this conversation, is clear, this is what's within our control. We can't control the fact that we were kicked out of practice, or that the obstacle or challenge we're facing, or we lost a game, or that last project didn't go the way that we hoped it would, or the meeting didn't go the way we would, or, oh my goodness, we are losing money and this product or service we're providing is not going the way that we hoped it would. Whatever that may be, then as we re-clarify and recalibrate the thermostat around why the mission, where the vision, how the values, then we can say, okay, well, what is within our control? And what is the game plan? What is our strategy for what we're going to do next? And how can each one of us around this circle set a different temperature next? The best players-only meetings, quote unquote, aren't disconnected from the coach. Even though the coach might not be in the room, The very best and the most effective times when these players-only meetings work is not because they come into the room and start pointing the fingers and placing the blame and bitching and moaning about somebody else or about the coach, but they actually are when the players themselves are taking ownership over that re-clarifying and recalibrating the thermostat, are being honest about identifying what are the challenges we're facing, re-clarifying or recalibrating the why are we doing it, where are we trying to go, and how are we committed to going there. And it's not disconnected from the coach. In fact, it's absolutely connected behind closed doors, even when the coach isn't in the room, of the clarity around that mission, vision, and values. And then internally, the team makes a commitment to say, how are we going to anchor these values and anchor this mission and vision next? And what is it that we all are going to take personal ownership over for the next actions we're going to put into place that are within our control and are going to set a different temperature? Those are the elements of when players-only meetings are most effective and begin to get teams and organizations back on track. So as always, with this podcast, I want to leave you with a few questions to ponder for your own journey. When was the last time that a quote-unquote players-only meeting you were a part of or that you can remember? When was the last time a players-only meeting was needed or you were a part of or that you remember? How and why was it effective or not? If you think back to that meeting, why was it effective or why was it not? And my guess is that it probably has to do with what we've been talking about on this podcast. And lastly, I would just invite you to think about how could you help facilitate players-only meetings that identify those challenges, those obstacles that you're facing, and then reclarify, recalibrate the thermostat around why are you doing it, the mission, the vision of where you're trying to go, the values of how you're trying to travel together, and then clarify what are those next actions that are within your control that everyone can be clear and committed to those next actions, those next step forwards out of that important meeting. Remember, the best leaders, teams, and cultures on the planet stimulate progress by recalibrating that thermostat and then setting a temperature together.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using. And share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to your organization, or you have a question or comment about this podcast, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we all are ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.